All right, we're back and we're going to talk about emotional understanding out of Salovey et al.'s model. Okay, so here's a nice little picture of different kinds of emotions that the different plants seem to be displaying. We've got, for some reason, the poor bee gets labeled as angry. Of course, the other bee is labeled calm, so I guess not all bees are angry. We've got a flower that's feeling loved, another one that's feeling sad and jealous and sleepy and grumpy and bored and happy, and there are a lot of other emotions probably that we could have labeled here. Emotional understanding describes our ability to label emotions. Good job, whoever made this picture. It wasn't me. Um, our ability to understand the causes of emotions and the consequences of emotions, right? So if we understand what causes us to feel the way that we're feeling, um, it that's going to give us more understanding, right? That's going to be make us aware that certain factors tend to make us feel certain ways, right? Um, or as the young folks might call it, a certain type of way. Um, so understanding the causes may help us to maybe prevent ourselves from having just I always like to call it a knee-jerk reaction to a situation that maybe typically does generate certain emotions in us. If we don't want to have that emotional reaction, but we're aware that this is maybe what some people call a trigger for us, maybe we could take steps to not react the way that our knee-jerk reaction wants us to. Because maybe we've come to understand the consequences of our emotions. Maybe we've come to understand that when we're holding certain emotions, it causes us to behave in ways that maybe we don't like. And so that might be the motivation for identifying a cause and then trying to avoid the natural emotional response. I'm not arguing for denying emotions. I'm saying maybe I can take steps to make sure that this event doesn't trigger this reaction in me without my intending to. Um, some emotions have great outcomes. And so, if we realize that sometimes, for example, if we cry about something that's sad, it elicits support from our environment, right? Maybe we will be more comfortable letting that out. If we recognize that, you know what, it actually makes me feel better if I let it out because the consequence of me letting it out, I understand that the cause is that maybe I heard some bad news. And when I hear bad news, I feel like crying. And then what I discover is that when I do cry because I'm sad, that it elicits support from my environment and that makes me feel better. So maybe in the future I won't try to deny that I'm sad. Maybe I will let my emotions out so that they can have the beneficial effect that they tend to have. The last thing here on our list is recognize relationships between causes and consequences of emotions. So in this last step, we recognize that there are certain things that cause us to feel certain ways, and those same things may also be the reason why we get the consequences we do. So, if we have, let's say, a particular circumstance, I got bad news and I'm at home, I maybe opened a letter and it has some kind of bad news in it. And I know that if I start crying over this bad news, that the person who I share my home with will provide me with some support and empathy and I'll feel better. Um, we may maybe I won't be afraid to open the mail while I'm at home because I know that my ready-made support system is here, because if I do get upset or I do get angry or something from something I've opened in the mail, I know I'll have the support that I need. So I know what the cause of my potential emotion is, and I know that the consequence of a potential emotion might be, support. What if I am somebody who at work opens mail? And maybe sometimes at work I open letters that have bad news. And I know that opening letters that have bad news sometimes makes me emotional. Well, I need to maybe not cry at work. I know that sometimes when I'm feeling emotional from something I've opened in the mail, I cry. So maybe I want to not cry. I want to maybe come up with a new consequence of my emotion, right? Because I think if I cry at work, I may be judged in a certain way. And so maybe I don't want that to happen. So recognizing that this particular cause could lead to the consequence of me expressing an emotion that could have downhill consequences from that. So becoming aware of those things is a big step towards learning to regulate your own emotions, right? Figuring out a way to maybe have that cause still be present, but not necessarily lead to the consequence. So our culture helps to determine to a certain extent how we understand emotions. Whoops, I clicked on the wrong thing again. It's my favorite thing is clicking on the wrong stuff. I don't know how I'm doing it is what the question is. So here we are. Okay. So in Japan, there is a word amai, which roughly translates to sweet dependency, and it's really that security that a baby feels with its mother. There's no equivalent word, single word in English, even though certainly we all have that same emotion, right? All human babies, probably not even just human babies, probably lots of, especially mammal babies, I would say probably, but maybe it's even more than that, have that same dependency on their mom that is a beautiful thing, right? And so everybody probably has the emotion, but the fact that in Japan they acknowledge it and gave it a word means that they have a certain understanding of that emotion in a way that maybe no one else really understands. Certainly no one in English, English-speaking monolingual understands it like a Japanese person who it's just part of their cultural awareness. How about Bedouins in Egypt who really value autonomy? They really think independence is like key. We see some emotional behavior that goes along with that, that seems consistent with that value system. They really, when they have a loss, if their camel dies, a loved one dies, a valuable possession goes missing, they don't express that loss the way that maybe you might expect. It's not a universal to be expressive of your sense of loss. They try not to express any kind of hurt, physical or emotional hurt. It's just part of their I'll take care of it myself kind of general cultural attitude. When they do express emotions, it's more likely going to be something like anger or placing blame. Who took my object, is going to become the subject of the conversation rather than I need my object and I value my object and I want my object back. Instead, it's like who took it or whose fault is it or who didn't watch it or whatever. Kind of a different approach to that kind of emotion, right? In Tahiti, they don't have terms for sadness, longing, or loneliness. Certainly they feel those things. When a loved one leaves for a vacation or, goes to work even, I'm sure they have these feelings, but no words. Meanwhile, they have words for, like several words for fear. And very specific to the kind of fear that you might be having. Maybe you could say, oh, we have it in English because we have all these different words for phobias, arachnophobia, acrophobia, agoraphobia. I haven't even gotten out of the A's and I've gotten 3 out, right? That's not what I'm talking about because those are all, terms for which object you have a specific phobia about. Here, when we're talking about the Tahitian language, we're talking about different things that you might fear. So, for example, maha meha refers to the eerie feeling that you get in the presence of the supernatural. Okay, that's pretty specific. As opposed to they may have a specific word for the fear of drowning or the fear of losing a loved one. They would have different words for these different things that they might be fearful of. So that kind of gives the impression that in the Tahitian culture, fear is much more, I don't want to say important, I want to say something more like influential for them than something like sadness would be, or that longing would be, or loneliness would be. And it's possible that in the Tahitian culture, they don't have an experience of loneliness in the way that maybe a Eurocentric kind of perspective would be, or a Bedouin perspective would be, where it's like, yeah, I spend time alone. And miss I long for my loved ones while I'm gone. These kinds of things. Maybe they don't have that because of the integration of their community and what they do. Whatever it is, it causes them probably to think about their emotions differently. When they do have lots of names for some things and no names for other things, it certainly gives an impression of sort of how they understand their own emotions. Our last category in the Salovey et al. Model is emotional management. So this is the ability to reflect on our emotions and disclose them appropriately to others. And this is a tough one because, knowing what emotions we're having, that's ability, reflecting on our emotions and thinking about them, and then thinking about what they do to us. So it's one thing to know like what emotion it is, and then what it's doing to me, how it's affecting my behavior, and how it's affecting my thoughts, and how it's affecting my relationships and stuff like that. And then to talk about it appropriately with others, right? Disclose those to maybe your loved ones or your therapist or your friends or whatever, is what we're talking about. And so here I have a little video for you to watch that involves Paul Ekman again. And he's talking a little bit about how to manage emotions, reflect on them, and disclose them appropriately to other people. So I'll put that on the playlist so you'll have a chance to watch that. The key things, takeaways in these issues are that you have to become aware of what your emotions are. A lot of people are not aware of what emotion they're experiencing at any given moment. A lot of times the emotion we're experiencing is neutral. I'm not having an emotion right now. I'm here. Other times there is an emotion being experienced, and we can tell that by the heart rate or the blood pressure. We know that there is an emotion that's going on. And when you ask a person, okay, your heart rate's up and your blood pressure's up, what are you feeling right now? And they'll say, nothing, or they'll be a little bit stumped by, I don't know why they would be up. I'm not feeling anything. You need to be aware of those emotions, right? In order to take the next step, which is take control of the emotions. Determine how you're going to experience them, determine how you're going to express them. So a good way to think about it is you've got, some stimulus out in the world, and then inside your head, you have like the emotion, you filter it, you interpret it all inside of your head, and then back out into the environment, you have behaviors that are being based on that emotion. And so during the stuff that's happening inside of your head is where you're going to take control of those emotions and decide how to behave, decide how to act. For those of you who have had the pleasure of taking compassion-focused therapy, that's one of the big themes in that field, is the idea of having more compassion for yourself and the emotions that you're experiencing, so that then you can take control of those emotions. Because as long as you're in the denial phase, where you're saying, I shouldn't be feeling like this, and so I'll pretend to myself that I'm not, I'll call it denial, right? That's a Freudian term, but I think it's appropriate. I'm going to deny that I'm experiencing that emotion because I don't think it's appropriate that I'm holding that emotion. It's going to be a lot more difficult to take control of that emotion and how you express yourself. So here's a nice cartoon. Use your words, Lewis. Tell Kelso how you feel. And so Lewis says, I feel like pouring paint all over your head. Well, you know what? Saying that out loud is better than pouring paint all over her head, right? So now it would be better if more of that was happening inside of his head and he learned to manage it, but he's a little kid. Mom's trying to help him to identify his emotions, and certainly it's better to use his words than it is to actually pour paint over Keiko's head. I called her Kelso. Sorry, Keiko. So emotional management is oftentimes referred to as emotional regulation. How do we regulate our emotions? How do we manage them? We can increase our ability to manage our emotions by using what we call cognitive reappraisal. In this process, we reinterpret the meaning of adverse events with a goal of viewing them as less negative. We all have negative or adverse events happen to us. If we label that, oh no, this is the worst thing ever. Why does this always happen to me, right? that can lead to negative emotions. It can cause emotions to go out of control. But if instead you say, well, it's just a hiccup, it's just a small thing, it's nothing personal. I think if we can take the personal out of adverse events, a lot of times adverse events are just random occurrences. So if we can sort of take the personal out, it's much more likely that then we can view that event as neutral or just bad luck at the moment, not permanent bad luck that is always going to be bad luck. When we reinterpret adverse events as less negative, we actually see the effects of that in the physiological measurements. We actually see people's heart rates go down and their blood pressure go down. And as a result, we see their emotional expressions being much more muted. They are not as angry. They're not as distressed. They're not as scared as they were before they started the cognitive reappraisal. And then there's mindfulness meditation that can allow for emotional management. So that I'm hearing a lot of people, I've been reading articles in popular literature, like Good Housekeeping and places like that, that advocate for mindfulness. And that's great, except for they're kind of describing it wrong. Mindfulness is not about tuning out. It's about engaging with the details. So consciously dwell in the present moment. One bad example I saw in Good Housekeeping, so this is not correct. This is what they said in Good Housekeeping is, when you're doing the dishes, take that opportunity to think about your day and think about, tomorrow and, use it as an opportunity to basically tune out of what you're doing. True mindfulness would say, while you're washing the dishes, really engage in it. Think about the warmth of the water. Think about how slippery the soap feels. Think about how once you've rinsed the dish, it feels squeaky. Think about that. Think about if your back is hurting while you're doing it, think, man, my back hurts while I'm washing dishes. I am experiencing that. If you experience a negative emotion, mindfulness says, acknowledge that emotion and dwell in that emotion. Say to yourself, okay, I'm feeling scared right now. Why am I feeling scared? Okay, I've labeled the source of it. What can I do with this scared feeling I'm having? Why am I feeling fearful? How can I alter this? And really dwell in it and acknowledge it. It's not about tuning out. By engaging in mindfulness and being here in the now and in the present, it precludes you from fretting about the future. If you're thinking about the slipperiness of the dish soap, you are certainly not thinking about, I've got an exam tomorrow, right? So engaging in the moment will help to reduce anxiety about the future for sure. That's the purpose of mindfulness meditation. And it's not a meditation like a big transcendental meditation. It's a meditation as in, I am going to focus on my body, my thoughts, myself right now. I'm going to engage entirely in the experience I'm having right now. It's a tough one. I can better think about the slipperiness of the soap than I can, sit out in nature and listen to the birds chirp. I don't know what is wrong with me. I can't just relax and enjoy that. And so that's something I'm going to try and work on. That's going to be my exercise this summer, is to try and really engage in just relaxed, pleasurable moments and try not to always think I'm supposed to be working or doing something. That's going to be my goal. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and stop here and we'll wrap this up in the next video.